Today I'll be talking about misogynistic pathways to radicalization as well as online gender-based violence. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is based on a paper by Sarah Bunsen, which I very much recommend checking out, as well as some other ISD studies, so I'll signpost that throughout the presentation. So very quickly, before diving into the subject matter, who are we at ISD? So we are a think and do tank that counter sort of the rise in hate, extremism, and disinformation across the globe. We've got an office here in London, which is where I'm based, but we are also based in Berlin, Washington, and Amman in Jordan. And in terms of the work streams that we have, first of all, we do research and digital analysis to be able to understand who are the actors, what are the tactics, what is happening online, what is the threat. Based in disinformation, hate, and extremism. Then we go in with digital policy, so basically giving advice to tech companies on how to counter these forms of speech, as well as give advice to regulatory efforts, regulators in terms of giving best practice to tech companies, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, we did start in 2006, so we do have a very long-standing experience, I should say, in terms of training, education, and delivering interventions, both offline and online. So that's the third pillar of what we do. So diving into online gender-based violence and radicalization. So what I hope to do is build on the previous two excellent presentations from like a policy work stream as well. So before I dive into that, online gender-based violence has been given a lot more attention, which is a very welcome thing. But this has also led to a bit of confusion about what actually is online gender-based violence. And so this is what I want to dive in now. I'll be using a definition employed by UN Women that basically said that online gender-based violence, or OGBV, is a subset of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, which also has an acronym. It's another world of acronyms. But they define it as any act that is committed, assisted, aggravated, or amplified by the use of information communication technologies or other digital tools that results in, or is likely to result in, physical, sexual, psychological, social, political, or economic harm, or any other infringements of rights and freedoms. I understand that this is a very high-level definition, but throughout this presentation, I'll talk a lot more about the tactics and accompanying harms that actually follow from this. What I really want to drive home is that OGBV doesn't just affect women, girls, marginalized gender communities, or intersectional communities like the LGBTQI+ community. What it really affects is our democracies because of the online gender-based violence that women and girls and others are receiving. There's a silencing effect, and it's almost a new glass ceiling for women. If we want to make an example that is relevant to this room, for instance, I might not want to publish something on online gender-based violence because of the potential harassment I could get. Therefore, I participate less in research. Now, if you take that on a more, on a bigger scale, for example, female politicians, female journalists, women in public positions are actually also more likely to receive online gender-based violence. Now, obviously, if they were to step down from their careers or not want to participate in these public roles, then that evidently affects, our democratic norms and values that make up our democracy and our human rights. So it has a way bigger effect than sometimes I think we give it credit for. And then finally, what is a good thing is that OGBV, or online misogyny, or the different terms that we want to give it, is increasingly recognized as a vector of radicalization across ideologies, both online and offline, disrupting on a public and private level. Public, I mean the bigger incel attackers that Joe was mentioning before, that are considered terrorists now, but on a private level, more to women individually. So what are the tactics of online gender-based violence? So oftentimes when we speak about it, we only think about hate speech, but actually it gets a lot more granular than that. So examples include online gendered or sexualized mis and disinformation, harassment, impersonation, so pretending to be a woman whilst you're not, stalking and monitoring. This can happen online, but it can also have an offline effect. The offline effect can also be brought about by doxing. So for instance, releasing women's private information. And then also, which we'll be talking about tomorrow, so I don't want to steal that panel's thunder, but when we speak about generative AI, obviously we are dealing with a sort of an increased threat when it comes to deepfakes and image-based sexual abuse, which we'll talk more about tomorrow, so I'll leave that here. But I'll just say that that is something that we are seeing as a growing threat. And then finally, what I really want to hammer home here is that in the UK, for instance, we've got the credible and imminent threat to life policy, which evidently, if there is a credible and imminent threat to life, such as a death threat, you have the responsibility to report it. But actually, in that same policy, a threat to rape or a threat to serious sexual harassment is also included in that. But I feel like whenever we're sort of monitoring this or talking about this, it doesn't really get mentioned. So I just want to make it very clear that obviously a very direct and credible threat to life also is a tactic of online gender-based violence. What I want to point out here is that this is being used across terrorist ideologies, but it's obviously not only confined to the terrorist sphere or TVEC actors, I should say. It happens also as a tactic and goal in its own way. So whenever we speak about content moderation, which I'm glad, I think I'm going to be in full agreement with Joe and Evian on content moderation later, but when we talk about content moderation, I think it's very important to say, okay, this is the content, the tactics, but what's the actual harm? And so that's what I want to emphasize a bit more. So first of all, there's evidently a psychological harm, be that stress, PTSD, trauma. There's also a threat to reproductive health or health in general, especially young women, you might think in the US, for instance, that don't receive the right information about their physical health or reproductive health. It might actually lead to them not getting the right treatment that they need. The economic and career harm, that's what I kind of already spoke about. But again, women sort of facing harassment, therefore not wanting to progress in their careers or taking more of a position in the back with less visibility has an effect on their progression, has effect on their income. This evidently exacerbates structural gender inequality. It normalizes misogyny. I think from the manosphere presentation or the incel presentation by Joe, rape culture, rape myth, it normalizes that. And then also, I should say, it limits access to platforms. If you as a woman don't want to enter into a particular tech platform because you know you're going to be harassed, you might not want to engage there. And we might think, well, actually, why would women have to go on Discord? But it obviously goes beyond that, because in our information ecosystem, the online sphere is obviously incredibly important. So we can't just assume that it's fine that some women just can't go on particular platforms. The threat of violence, private and public manifestations, which I've mentioned before, and then the larger threat to democracy and the silencing effect on women. So I kind of want to turn a bit more to the policy now, so kind of having given the landscape, in terms of the current gaps that we're seeing on platforms and certain platform affordances that might actually lead to more OGBV spreading on the platform. So the current gaps, as I already alluded to, platforms generally cover online gender-based violence in their hate speech terms of service or community guidelines. As I've shown, it goes a lot, there's more tactics than just hate speech, and so that granularity is often missing, making sure that it's a bit harder to actually moderate effectively. Two gaps that I thought I'd highlight because I found them quite interesting. One by the Meta's Oversight Board, where they basically showed that users were mocking gender-based violence victims online, showing obviously an awful pattern there. And we found a bit of a similar study, and this study is going to become public in a few days, which I very much recommend. But we did a study on TikTok where it showed that actually what happened is that because TikTok was trying to counter OGBV, which is obviously a good thing, they actually over-removed legitimate conversations by survivors of gender-based violence, which was removed, and then they under-removed or didn't adequately moderate harmful material or harmful conspiracy narratives when it comes to online gender-based violence. One was related to the Rape Hoax Day, which was basically the idea that rape was becoming legal for a day, which really manifested on TikTok, but then again censored women talking about rape in a legitimate way. Now, I could talk about the content, but what we do at ISD is we focus a lot more on the affordances that platforms might have that might make OGBV or other online harms spread on the platform. And one of the things I'll highlight here is algorithmic amplification. So we've seen that algorithmic amplification does promote OGBV across platforms, and I'll give an example on YouTube in a second. On X, you can definitely see this also because obviously you can now buy blue ticks or verified accounts, and we're seeing a lot of OGBV being spread that way. The second thing I want to highlight is dark patterns which kind of goes together with interface limitations. So I think for anyone sort of in the OGBV landscape, usually what you hear is that reporting mechanisms can be quite hard to find. I think for terrorist content, which is my other area of expertise, it's become a lot more clear, and by legislation demanded that it becomes more clear. But for OGBV, it can be very hard to actually know where to report it, under what rule, et cetera, et cetera. And again, if you're wanting to report something, it should be as easy as possible, and to also help the platform moderate this material. The other thing I would highlight is that sometimes privacy settings are, the normal sort of standardized privacy settings are usually quite open, whilst actually for women and girls and other marginalized communities, it might be better if it's very clear to say, well, actually, this is what you can do from a privacy setting point of view, to make sure that you're more protected than a completely open platform. So there's basically a few things that platforms can do from like a systematic user interface point of view that could really help with the mitigation of this. So just to give an example of this, because I know that I've been talking quite high level, in 2022, which is a while ago, I admit, IC created a small study where we basically had 10 accounts impersonating right-wing men and boys. And what happened is that we really saw that through sort of, through the recommendation system, anti-trans, misogynistic, and manosphere views were recommended to those users. Now, what I find interesting is that oftentimes when we speak about the manosphere and the far right, it's usually a one-way street where people say, well, actually, the manosphere could be a gateway to the right-wing scene. But this shows, obviously, that it can also be the other way around. And so I just want to highlight that, if we look at misogyny, if you take that as an entry point, you can see sort of the different relationships and how it cuts across these ideological forms of extremism and terrorism. Then I've got recommendations for platforms. I just want to check on time, Emma, how I'm doing.
You've got about 1 minute left.
Okay, perfect. So we're going to race through these recommendations. I've got a few for platforms and then for governments as well. So first of all, I would say, and this is now by regulation demanded of some, but providing API access to make sure that researchers like myself, to be honest, can do more research and also help platforms tackle this problem, because I think it's one of these areas where it's not so much started because obviously it's been a problem for a very long time, but it's getting a lot of attention. And so through doing better research, we can obviously help platforms counter this growing problem. In transparency reporting, it would be very welcome if platforms actually started reporting on this, because then again, we could help see if enforcement measures are actually having the desired effects. Including survivor groups and third-party organizations in content moderation is very important to make sure, again, kind of highlighting the over-removal of legitimate speech and under-removing harmful material. And also from our TikTok study, we kind of saw like auditing and mitigating misogyny in AI-based systems. So making sure that we have the right terminology and that these AI systems, that we're measuring what the effect it has on content moderation. Finally, in terms of the legislative landscape, so obviously we've spoken a lot about OGBV, what it is, but I would still say that from a legislative point of view, we're still looking at very wide-ranging definitions without a lot of granularity, and we're going to have to get to the granularity if we want to know what to do about it. And one of the one of the laws that really, I think, begins to do this is the directive coming from the EU. On combating violence against women and domestic violence, because Article 19 finally starts defining some of the crimes associated to online gender-based violence, such as non-consensual sharing of imagery, cyber stalking, cyber harassment, focusing on generation of deepfakes with artificial intelligence. So it kind of finally provides like what is not allowed, because I think with OGBV, oftentimes we think borderline content, but actually some of these harms are already legislated against, and we should recognize it as such. So that's the first thing. In terms of in the UK, where we are now, we're very happy seeing the Home Secretary's review of the counter-extremism strategy and potentially wanting to include extreme misogyny and highlighting that this cuts across ideological forms of extremism, so very much looking forward to the results of that. What I would say, though, is that obviously misogyny is not just related to the extremism sphere, it's an everyday violence and should be recognized as such. So if we're going to call it extremism, then in some ways we should also recognize it as a hate crime. And finally, and I'll end with that, is, which I hopefully have said multiple times now, but we should take a taxonomy point of view. We need to be extremely precise about what language we use when OGBV, or how OGBV manifests itself, whether it's borderline content, extremist content, terrorist content, mis and disinformation, because based on that, we have to take enforcement mechanisms. And I completely agree with the previous panelists that we're not going to remove our way out of this problem. But what I should say is that some of these are illegal forms of speech. They should be removed. However, obviously, we should use the full arsenal of alternatives to content removal to make sure that the rest of the categories are tackled with, mixed with offline intervention, because obviously this is not an online problem, starts offline. So making sure that through education and intervention, we tackle this offline and online together. With that, I'll pause there. Thank you very much.